The NDA government had an outstanding advantage when it came to power in 2014. It had a two-thirds majority in the lower house, something which no government has had for the past 26 years. Has it put this advantage to good use? What's the macro record of the Modi government in its first 3 years? Let's ask undoubtedly the best expert on macroeconomics in the government, Chief Economic Advisor in the Finance Ministry, Dr. Arvind Subramanian. Dr. Subramanian, thank you very much. Well, that really is the first question, sir. With a big advantage of two-thirds majority, governments can normally take mature decisions, difficult decisions. What is your macro scorecard rating of the government?
Yeah, if in order to answer that question, we just have to, go back and contrast where we are today to where we were, say, in late 2013. India was in the almost had a full-blown crisis, and investors were fleeing, and the rupee was under pressure. And generally the sense that the economy was on a downward spiral. So if you roll the tape 3 years hence, I think we're in a very, very different situation in terms of the overall macroeconomy. As you know very well, inflation is below 3%. The fiscal deficit, central government has been coming down very steadily. Reserves are very comfortable. And there is a sense that the macroeconomy is really robust and stable. Remember that sound macroeconomics is the foundation on which everything else is built. So I think that's a huge change and a huge achievement. Number one, I think over and above that, of course, India is amongst the fastest growing countries in the world, so that it's not just that we have stability that we've seen, that we are seen as a country of tremendous opportunity and returns to investors. All that, of course, those outcomes are, I think, backed up by a number of, policy achievements. I would say, 3 or 4, big ones. I'm not trying to be exhaustive here, but first of all, I think that, the sense that corruption, the transparency in disposal of public assets, decisive decision making, I think that investors seem to have really warmed to that, especially in contrast with the past. I think the GST is an absolute game-changing reform that's taken place. I think the architecture of JAM, which is going to really transform in many ways the way in which the government interacts with citizens, direct benefit transfers, all of that I think is actually fundamentally very, very transformational. And of course, on the FDI front, we have opened up, and that's reflected in the fact that India has got the highest FDI ever, $65 billion, depending upon how you count. I think, and in addition, there have been the bankruptcy code, the MPC, all of that. So I think that it is a very different economy today than it was 3.5 years ago. Since you say very correctly
that it's GST and Jan Dhan and getting more people into the formal economy, would you say that the tax to GDP ratio is all set to increase?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, it's going to increase in a number of ways. I think one, we're going to have, the GST with all this invoice matching, better compliance. So the indirect tax to GDP ratio will go up on that score. Second, remember that with the GST, we're going to also see, compliance gains on the income tax side, because, indirect tax data and direct tax returns, there is a certain matching that one can do using big data. And I think that, and the third, of course, is that, if the experience of last year, 2016-17, that actually many more taxpayers have entered the tax net because the environment has changed, some of it due to, the signal from demonetization, then all of these, I think, could really make tax receipts quite buoyant in India and increase the tax to GDP ratio. However, the caveat I would draw is that one should not try and do these assessments like, every day or very soon. I think this is going to be a trend development, and I do think that in the medium term, as a result of all these actions, the tax to GDP ratio should rise significantly, indirect and direct taxes.
Okay. Now let me come to the first macro for which you gave an A to the NDA government: growth. As you said correctly, that we are a standout performer, especially in the current global scenario. And yet, in your article, you have clearly advised against a definite overestimation of growth that will come because of the revision in the IIP series and the revision in the wholesale price index series. Are you worried about the growth?
Yeah, I have a piece today which, tries to explain. You see, recently we've had revisions to the IIP and WPI data. What I'm trying to set out in the piece today is that to say that there are certain consequences of that for the GDP, or actually the GVA data that will come out later. Let's be a little bit cautious about the impact of these revisions on the estimates that will come out, because there are some quirks in the way we do the GDP which should make us cautious about how we interpret that. And my sense is that inflation is under control, I think is well under control. The inflation outlook is very benign. And the new IIP data especially seem to me to suggest that the economy could do with a lot of macro policy support. In
your Mint article, as well as in your V.K. R.V. Rao memorial lecture, you're making a strong case for monetary easing. Do you think that the Reserve Bank has been too tight too early?
Look, I think we have a monetary policy committee that makes all these decisions. All I can say is that it seems to me that they've done a terrific job on bringing inflation, under control, well beyond what the target requires. So I think it's a great achievement. I think that the inflation outlook is actually relatively benign. If you look at, the fact that the exchange rate has appreciated, oil price outlook is good, monsoons are good. Moreover, the GST, for example, the incidence is going to come down. So if you put all of these things together, it seems to me that the inflation outlook is relatively benign. And on top of that, if you look at how the economy is doing, that it's perhaps not as strong as we want it to be, and maybe not as strong relative to potential, then I think the implications follow from that analysis.
Okay. There is no formal way in which I think the government meets the MPC members. We know that the governor meets the finance minister ahead of the monetary policy. Do you think that institutional arrangement needs to be in place where there is an interaction? Government is a legitimate representative of interests. So is that institutional mechanism needed where government speaks with the MPC members, external members included?
Yes, see, I think that for one thing, I think the Act itself provides for that government input. But I think I want to kind of interpret that more broadly, not in a kind of legalistic sense. The spirit of my V.K. R.V. Rao memorial lecture is that, we should have more voices and opinions and informed. And I think even from the point of view of the Monetary Policy Committee, I think they would welcome and benefit from a wide range of views, including, the views of the government on this. So I think it just makes for, more informed decision making.
Are you also surprised that there was unanimity in all the decisions that the MPC has taken so far? I think, 4 of them now?
Yeah, I think it is kind of surprising and interesting, isn't it? I mean, you would think that given how complex these things are, and, in fact, how there are different, interpretations of the macroeconomy. Because remember, what I offered, the assessment that I offered just now, benign inflation, possibilities for more, i.e. larger output gaps, that's only one interpretation. There are other interpretations as well. And, I would have expected that, the range of views would get reflected. And, as I joked in the lecture that, normally the criticism criticism against economists is that you ask 3 economists, you get 4 views, but here it seems to be that, you ask many economists and you get kind of 1 view, and that's a bit surprising, and it's very interesting. Maybe the data and the facts warrant that convergence of opinion, but in my view, they probably don't. I think there is a kind of rich way of interpreting the data in multiple ways, I think.
Oh, yes. Some governments would like 100 economists, and we've got one, perhaps. Well, you touched on the rupee. We did have the April trade deficit numbers widen, $13 billion after about, 30 months or so, that bigger number. Imports rose by 39% year on year. Are you worrying that some Indian business is being captured by foreign companies?
See, I think that, again, this is something that's very interesting, what's happening. Both exports and imports have gone up. And, you need to do this carefully on the export side. You need to take out oil because, oil exports tend to be volatile as well, depending upon oil prices. But export volumes have risen quite substantially over 3 quarters, I think, and that's very good news. On the import side, it's very interesting. I think a couple of things are going on. One is there was a huge surge in gold imports as well, which I think one should, take away. But even taking away from that, imports rose quite sharply. I think there's a kind of positive and a less positive side to that. I think the positive thing is that it shows that maybe domestic demand is coming back again, which is what is leading to higher imports, and that's a good sign. That's a sign that the economy is perking up. But on the other hand, you also see part of the increase in imports could be due to deteriorating competitiveness, and that's something that we should be watchful about. I think that our exports as well as our import competing sectors, their performance is sensitive to the exchange rate, and so we have to be very watchful on that.
And the exchange rate is sensitive to the Reserve Bank's monetary policy stance and the monetary policy rate. If you were in the MPC, what would your repo rate be today?
I think hypotheticals should remain hypotheticals. I think all I can provide, to the best of my ability, is my assessment of the macroeconomy, which I've kind of laid out to you. So
yeah.
I think we leave hypotheticals as they are.
All right. Okay. Let me just wind up this part of the macro analysis with just a final question. You spoke correctly that there should be an institutional arrangement whereby the MPC members, all of them, external and RBI members, are exposed to all kinds of views. So is the government formally pushing it and asking for an audience with the MPC members at a formal or informal level?
Yeah, I think, these are matters that are being discussed, and, you'll find out whether soon, we will. I think there are ways of interacting which I think all of us are open to, and, let's see how these things evolve. I think, but the principle that there should be, more input from all sides, including government inputs into, decision making is, I think, widely accepted, luckily.
Fair point, sir. Yes, sir. No two ways about it. It's a representative of a large number of interests and should logically, have its say when policy is being made. We have to take a quick break, but I have a few more questions for you on the global environment as well. You are a China expert. You bring a wealth of trade experience. So just a couple of questions on the global environment in a minute with Dr. Arvind Subramanian.